The steel is still warm under Feldwebel Kessler's palm when he pulls his hand back, blistered, cursing under his breath in the July heat. The orchard smells of apples and cooked oil. He climbs the hull of the dead tiger the way a man climbs something he respects, boots finding the tow hooks, fingers tracing the 88 millimeters of frontal armor that was supposed to make this machine immortal. He runs his hand across the glacis. No penetration, no gouge. The front plate that turned aside every British six-pounder in the hedgerows is clean, unmarked, arrogant even in death, so he cannot understand why the crew inside is dead. Kessler is not a tank man. He belongs to a recovery detachment, one of the grimy specialists the Wehrmacht sent to drag broken armor back to the workshops, and he has crawled over more wrecks in 6 weeks of Normandy than he can count. If you have ever wondered how a single new American weapon rewrote the rules for the most feared tank of the war, subscribe and stay with this, because the answer starts with the hole Kessler is about to find. Like the video if you want more of these, and tell me in the comments which German tank you think should be next. He knows the grammar of destruction. He knows what a mine does to a road wheel, what a flanking shot does to the thin plate behind the driver. This wreck speaks a language he has never read. He climbs higher, onto the turret, and there it is. A ragged puncture in the turret roof, punched downward, the edges curled inward, like the lid of a tin can opened from above. The metal around it has bloomed outward in a small crater of scorched paint. Whatever did this came from the sky, straight down, through 26 millimeters of roof armor that no designer in Kassel had ever expected an enemy to seriously attack. Kessler leans over the hole and looks inside, and immediately wishes he had not. The interior tells the rest. The fighting compartment is gutted, ammunition stowage detonated, the propellant charges gone up in the enclosed space, temperatures high enough to warp the breech of the 88 and fuse the commander's optics into slag. 5 men served this tank. What the recovery crew will remove from it fits in far less space than 5 men should occupy. The killing wound entered where no one was armored, where the crew felt safest, in the one plane of the machine they never watched. The front plate held, the roof did not, and the crew died anyway. Kessler and men like him saw this again and again across the Norman summer of 1944, and the pattern refused to make sense to them. The Tiger was built around a philosophy: face the enemy, present the thickest armor forward, fight from hull-down positions where only the glacis and the mantlet showed. Everything about the machine assumed the threat lived on the horizon, at eye level, firing flat. The panzer crews trained for that war. They were very good at that war. What descended on them in Normandy did not fire flat. It came down at an angle from 3,000 feet, faster than the eye could follow, and it did not care how thick the front plate was, because it never touched the front plate. The German recovery reports began to note it. Tigers and panthers found in open country and in orchards and along the sunken lanes, immobilized or dead, with the fatal damage on the top surfaces, engine deck, turret roof, the thin plate over the crew. Not the front, almost never the front. Intelligence officers reading these summaries in the rear had a word for the cause, and the word was Jabo, their slang for the Allied fighter bomber, the Jagd bomber, the thing that owned the sky over the beachhead from dawn until dusk. But slang is not an explanation. Knowing an aircraft killed the tank did not tell Kessler how a machine screaming past at over 300 miles an hour could put a projectile through a specific 26-millimeter plate the size of a card table from above and do it often enough to matter. Cannon fire scratched a Tiger. Ordinary bombs had to land almost on top of one to do anything. Something new was reaching down out of the Norman sky and reading the exact weakness in the strongest tank Germany fielded. Kessler climbs down off the hull. He does not have the answer. The men who sent the report up the chain did not have it either. To understand what punched that hole in the turret roof and why the crews who trusted their front armor never saw it coming, we have to go back several years to a problem the Americans had not yet solved. 1941. Henschel and Son, in Kassel, is building a machine to a set of requirements that assume one kind of fight. The German army had been ambushed, not by the enemy, but by its own intelligence failure. In the summer of that year, the Wehrmacht rolled into the Soviet Union expecting to find the tanks it had catalogued. Instead, it ran into the T-34 and the KV-1, sloped armor and a 76-millimeter gun, machines that shrugged off the standard German anti-tank round and kept coming. The shock ran all the way up the chain. Panzer crews reported firing round after round and watching them skip off. The response, drawn up in a hurry and hardened into Doctrine, was a demand for a heavy tank that could out-armor and outshoot anything it met on the open steppe. Face it, kill it before it closes, survive whatever it sends back. Everything that made the Tiger terrifying flowed from that one sentence. The design put its weight where the Doctrine said the danger was. 100 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel across the front hull. 100 millimeters on the gun mantlet, curved to deflect. The 88 millimeter KWK-36, adapted from the anti-aircraft gun that had already earned its reputation punching holes in French and British armor, now mounted in a turret and able to kill a Sherman or a T-34 at more than a mile. In a straight duel across flat ground, the Tiger was very close to what the requirement asked for. A well-sighted Tiger could hold a road, a ridge, a village approach, and force an entire armored column to stop and think. But armor is a budget, and no tank carries enough of it to be thick everywhere. Every plate you add to the front is weight you have to subtract somewhere else, or the engine cannot move it, and the bridges cannot hold it. The Tiger already strained at 57 tons. Its Maybach engine was chronically overworked, its final drives fragile, its fuel consumption ruinous. The designers spent their armor budget the way the Doctrine told them to, forward and to the sides, where a flanking gun might catch it. The roof got 25 to 26 millimeters. The engine deck, the gratings over the radiators, thin plate and open louvers. The rationale was simple and, for the war they were planning to fight, entirely reasonable. Nothing at ground level shoots down through a roof. Artillery airbursts might rattle it. A freak plunging shell might find it. Those were edge cases, and you do not spend tonnage on edge cases when the front plate is where you live or die. So the strongest tank in the world was built with its back to the sky. Look at the numbers side by side. 100 millimeters at the front, 26 on top. A tank 4 times better protected against the threat it expected than against the threat it dismissed. On the Eastern Front, in the kind of long-range gunnery duel the machine was born for, that math held up beautifully. The Tiger crews learned to fight hull down, nose to the enemy, presenting the one aspect nothing in the Soviet inventory could reliably crack. They accumulated kill ratios that still get quoted today. Confidence hardened into something like faith, and faith, once it sets, stops asking questions. The crews train the way the tank was built, watch the horizon, angle the hull, keep the thick plate between you and the guns. Nowhere in that training did a man learn to fear the space directly above the commander's hatch, because in the war the Tiger was designed for, that space was empty. The Luftwaffe was supposed to own the sky. For the first years, over the steppe, it largely did. A Tiger commander in 1942 could go a whole campaign and never once look up with real fear. Here is the trap the Doctrine walked into. The Tiger was optimized for a battlefield the Germans no longer controlled by the summer of 1944. The requirement had been written for the East, for open ground and enemy tanks and friendly air cover overhead. Normandy offered none of that. It offered close country, narrow lanes, and a sky that belonged, from first light to last, to the Americans and the British. The machine did not change. The war around it did. Which means the 26 millimeters over the crew compartment, the number nobody in Kassel had thought worth arguing about, was about to become the most important measurement on the entire tank. Not because German engineering failed, because it succeeded at exactly the problem it was given, and the Americans were busy building something that asked a different question entirely. They were not going to attack the front plate at all. They were going to come from the one direction the Tiger's designers had written off. A grass strip near Cardenville, a few miles inland from Omaha Beach, June of 1944. The P-47 Thunderbolts come back low over the hedgerows, with their cowlings streaked black, and the pilots climb down and say the same thing to the armorers waiting by the revetments. The tanks are still there. The armorers already know, because they have counted the belts. Each Thunderbolt carried 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, more than 3,000 rounds of it. A wall of lead that could saw a truck in half and turn a locomotive into a colander. Against a Tiger, against a Panther, against anything with real armor plate, it was noise and sparks and nothing else. Watch what the 50 caliber actually did. A half-inch bullet leaving the muzzle at close to 2,900 feet per second is a serious thing against soft targets. And the 9th Air Force used it to wreck the German rear, the way a scythe wrecks a field. Trucks, staff cars, fuel bowsers, horse teams, the endless soft tail that every army drags behind it. But armor penetration is not about noise. It is about mass and angle and the hardness of the plate on the other end. A 50 caliber round, striking 26 millimeters of rolled steel at a shallow diving angle, does not punch through. It skips. Gun camera film from that summer shows the tracers walking across a Panzer's deck and glancing away in bright arcs like water off a hot skillet. The pilots could see it happening. They wrote it up. The strafing pass looked spectacular and left the tank driving. So the pilots went to the bombs. Each Thunderbolt could carry 500 pounds under each wing, sometimes 1,000, and a 500-pounder landing near a tank would kill it outright, flip it, split a track, stove in the thin belly plate with the shock. The problem was the word near. Hitting a 57-ton machine that measures roughly 20 feet by 12 from an aircraft in a shallow dive doing well over 300 miles an hour is a geometry problem that punishes the smallest error. The pilot is fighting the airframe. He has slipstream tearing at the controls, the target swelling in the windscreen for a second and a half, flak coming up, and a release point he has to judge by eye and instinct. Let go a quarter-second late, and the bomb sails 200 feet long. Let go early, and it falls short into the hedgerow. A near miss that would have shredded infantry in the open did nothing to a buttoned-up tank 40 feet away. The arithmetic was brutal, and the pilots felt it in their own bodies. Every attack run cost something. The dive meant pulling out low over ground. The Germans had ringed with 20mm and 37mm automatic cannon, and the thunderbolt came off the target heavy, slow, and low, exactly where the flak wanted it. Men were spending their lives on passes that scratched paint. Post-war assessment teams that went out to count the wrecks confirmed what the pilots suspected in the moment. When investigators examined knocked-out German armor in Normandy, the number actually destroyed by air-delivered guns and bombs turned out to be a small fraction of the claims. Most of the kills credited to aircraft, on inspection, showed no aircraft damage at all. The tanks had been abandoned, or run dry of fuel, or knocked out by ground fire, then strafed for good measure by a pilot who logged it and moved on. Read that carefully, because it cuts both ways. The airpower over Normandy was decisive, but not because it was punching holes in tigers. It was decisive because it made movement in daylight suicidal, because it strangled the fuel and the ammunition and the reinforcements before they ever reached the line, because it turned a road march into a graveyard of horses and burned trucks. The Jabo owned the sky. What the Jabo did not yet have was a way to reach down and kill the specific thing sitting in the orchard with 100mm facing the wrong enemy. The gap was obvious to everyone flying. The gun was accurate and could not penetrate. The bomb could kill and could not hit. What the pilots needed was something in between, a weapon carried in numbers, aimed like a gun along the line of the dive, but arriving with enough mass and enough velocity to drive clean through the top of a tank, something that flew straight, where the pilot was already pointing the airplane, so that hitting the tank and killing the tank became the same act. The armorers at Cardenville did not have it in June. By the killing summer that followed, they would be bolting it under the wings by the dozen, in launch tubes and on rails, and the first German crews to meet it would have no name for what came down on them. 5 inches across the nose, 3.5 feet long, 140 pounds of rocket motor and steel warhead, leaving the rail at roughly 1,300 feet per second. The Americans called it the High Velocity Aircraft Rocket, HVAR for short, and the men who built and flew it called it Holy Moses. The name came out of the test range, from a pilot's reaction the first time one lit off under his wing. It stuck because it was accurate. Nothing the fighter bombers had carried before left the airplane like this. The rocket that came before it, the older 3.25-inch model, had a fat motor and a thin punch, and it wandered. Holy Moses fixed the wandering by making the motor the same diameter as the warhead, a clean 5-inch tube that flew where it was pointed. That is the whole trick, and it is not a small one. A rocket that flies where the airplane is pointed can be aimed the way a gun is aimed, down the line of the dive, using the same reflector sight the pilot already used for the .50 calibers, which solved both halves of the problem at once. The gun was accurate and could not penetrate. The bomb could penetrate and could not hit. The 5-inch rocket arrived doing better than 900 miles an hour at impact, carrying enough mass to drive clean through 26 millimeters of deck plate and detonate inside, and it went where the reticle sat. A P-47 could carry 10 of them on zero-length launchers under the wings, or a Typhoon 8 on rails, and salvo them in a single pass. 10 rockets meant 10 chances to put steel through a roof from an aircraft that never had to fly directly over the target and expose its belly to the flak. Late 1944, the rails and the tubes were coming forward by the crate. The first hit looked a certain way from the inside, and the German reports show it. A 5-inch warhead punching the engine deck of a Panther set the fuel and started a fire the crew could not reach. One through the turret roof did what it did to Kessler's Tiger in the orchard. The propellant charges caught, and the interior became a furnace in under a second. The men closest to the hatches sometimes got out. Often the tank was found buttoned. The hatches never opened, because the thing that killed them arrived faster than the decision to move. The German after-action reports from that winter read like men arguing with their own eyes. Recovery officers described armor holed from above and could not make it fit the doctrine they had been handed. Some wrote it up as bomb damage, because a bomb was a thing they understood could come from the sky. Others attributed the top penetrations to artillery, to plunging heavy shells, because a shell fired from a gun was also a thing that made sense. The idea that an aircraft could deliberately aim a projectile at the roof of a specific tank and hit it and drive through. That took longer to write down, because it should not have been possible with the weapons they knew. There is a small counterfactual worth a breath. If the Germans had thickened the roof and engine deck plate a year earlier, when the T-34 scare rewrote everything else, the 5-inch rocket would have found a harder target and killed fewer crews. The metallurgy was not the obstacle, the doctrine was. They spent their tonnage forward, where the last war's danger lived, and they never revisited the number. Which brings us back to the 26 millimeters over the crew, and what happened when the salvos started coming down on it in earnest. The captured general recordings from that period catch the mood better than any report. One senior officer, taped by his own captors without knowing the microphones were running, complained bitterly about the situation his armor faced in the West. The phrase that recurs across those transcripts is the helplessness of it, the sense of being hunted from an angle they could not answer. "You could not move by day," was the essence of it, repeated in a dozen forms across a dozen interrogations. That is the shift Holy Moses forced. Not that it killed every tiger. It did not, and the post-war counts still show most German armor lost to ground fire, breakdown, and abandoned fuel tanks. The rocket's work was narrower and sharper. It closed the one door the Panzer crews had left open. It took the direction they never watched and turned it into the direction they feared most. A tank designed to face forward now had to worry about the sky, and there was nothing on it thick enough to help. The men who flew the rockets knew exactly what they had. The men underneath the rockets were still writing reports that refused to believe it. The whole road was a graveyard of vehicles. That line comes from a German officer describing a stretch of Norman highway after a fighter-bomber sweep, and it stays with you, because it is the enemy telling you what the roads had become. By the late summer of 1944, movement in daylight west of the Rhine was a wager a man made with his own life. The columns learned to travel at night, to hug the tree lines, to post air sentries who did nothing but scan the sky while the vehicles crept forward. A column caught in the open with rockets coming down had no good answer. The Tiger could not outrun a thunderbolt. It could not shoot back at something diving out of the sun at 400 miles an hour. It could only sit there, 57 tons of steel with its thin roof pointed up, and hope the pilot picked the truck in front instead. Listen to how the fear shows up in their own words, because the pattern repeats across dozens of separate accounts, men who never met, describing the same thing. The recordings from the British interrogation center at Trent Park caught it without the prisoners knowing. Captured German officers, housed in comfortable rooms wired with hidden microphones, talked among themselves the way men do when they think no one is listening. And the transcripts that survive are full of the fighter-bomber. They called it the Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, and the word carries a weight in those pages it never had in a manual. One general described how his men would not stay near their vehicles, how they scattered into the fields the moment an engine note reached them, because to be inside or beside a vehicle was to be a target. Another spoke of columns that simply dissolved, drivers abandoning trucks in the road and running for the ditches, leaving the fuel and the ammunition to burn where it stood. The helplessness is in the grammar. They do not describe fighting back, they describe hiding. The physical toll was constant, and it wore men down in a way the numbers alone do not capture. A tank crew buttoned inside a Tiger in August heat sat in a steel box that held the sun like an oven, sweating through their tunics, breathing the reek of oil and cordite and their own bodies, and now they did it with their eyes fixed on the roof hatch instead of the gun sight. Every distant engine note became a question. The rocket gave no warning worth the name. The diving thunderbolt was on the target and gone before the sound of the motor caught up. So the first thing a crew often knew of the attack was the impact itself, the whole tank ringing like a struck bell, the concussion driving through the hull and up through the seats into the base of the spine. Men who survived near misses describe the sensation more than the sight. The slam of overpressure, the grit and paint chips shaken loose from the interior and raining down in the dark, the ringing that stayed in the ears for hours. Erwin Rommel understood exactly what was happening to his army, and he wrote it down before a fighter bomber nearly killed him on a road near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery in July. Our operations in Normandy are tremendously hampered, and in some places even rendered impossible, he reported up the chain, describing an enemy air force whose activity was so intense that any daylight movement was, in his word, paralyzing. That is the commander of Army Group B, one of the finest field soldiers Germany produced, telling Berlin that the sky had taken the roads away from him. He was not describing morale. He was describing arithmetic. A division that can only move at night moves at a fraction of its speed, arrives late, arrives scattered, and reaches the front with its fuel trucks burned somewhere behind it. Here is the piece the German command could never solve. The rocket had turned every road into a killing zone, and there was no armor answer to it, because the answer would have meant rebuilding every tank in the inventory from the roof down. They could not do that in 1944. The factories were being bombed. The production lines were straining to replace losses at the front, and the men in Kassel and Kummersdorf, who might have thickened the deck plate, were fighting a different war entirely, one of raw output against a strategic bombing campaign that never let up. So the Tiger crews did the only thing left. They fought at night. They parked under trees. They draped their machines in cut branches and hoped the camouflage held. And every morning, when the light came up and the first engine note reached them from the west, they looked at the sky and understood that the strongest tank on Earth had become a place to die. The heat comes up off the road in waves, and inside the stalled Tiger, the crew can smell their own coolant, boiling somewhere behind the firewall. The engine quit 10 minutes ago on a straight stretch of open ground east of Mortagne, no tree line for 200 meters in any direction, and the driver has been fighting the starter while the commander stands half out of the cupola with a hand shading his eyes against the western light. There is nothing to hide behind. The branches they cut at dawn slid off when the tank lurched. 57 tons of the finest armor Germany ever rolled sits in the middle of a French road, with its thin roof pointed straight up at a sky that has already gone quiet in the wrong way. The commander hears the engine note before he sees anything. By then, it is too late for the thing that matters. A flight of P-47s comes out of the sun in a shallow dive, the lead ship dropping its nose until the reticle sits on the black shape below, and the pilot holds the line the way he was trained to hold it. Airplane pointed at the tank, thumb on the button, the whole machine steady in the dive for a second and a half. Then he salvos. 10 rockets leave the rails in a ripple, trailing white cordite smoke, accelerating away from the aircraft faster than the aircraft itself is moving. The crew inside hears nothing that resembles a warning. The rockets cross the last 400 meters in under a second, and the first thing the loader knows of the attack is the world coming apart above his head. A 5-inch warhead strikes the engine deck at better than 900 miles an hour, drives clean through 26 millimeters of plate that was never meant to stop it, and detonates inside the compartment where the fuel lines run. A second punches the roof behind the turret. A third skips off the glacis and bursts against the road, and the near miss alone lifts grit and paint chips off the interior walls in a stinging cloud. The overpressure arrives through the seats. It drives up through the base of the spine, and the ringing starts before the pain does. Then the fuel catches. Inside a burning Tiger, the temperature does not rise. It arrives, a furnace bloom that fills the fighting compartment in under a second and turns the air itself into something no lung can use. The commander in the cupola is thrown clear by the blast, blackened, alive, and he lands in the road and does not get up quickly. The 3 men below him never reach the hatches. The propellant charges stowed along the hull go off in a chain, and the turret, 11 tons of cast steel, lifts on the pressure and settles crooked on its ring, smoke pouring from every seam. The pilot is already gone. He never flew directly over the tank. He never gave the flak below a clean shot at his belly. He pointed the airplane, pressed the button, and pulled off to the west, and the killing happened 400 meters in front of him, while he was still climbing away. This is where the whole idea proves itself, not in a laboratory, not on a test range where a pilot first shouted the name that stuck. On an open road, against the machine the Reich built to be unkillable, the top attack problem that guns could not solve and bombs could not hit came down to a rocket that flew where the reticle sat and drove through the one plate nobody had thickened. Feldwebel Kessler's Tiger in the orchard, 3 weeks earlier, had been the riddle. This was the answer, repeated on road after road through that August, until the recovery crews stopped bothering to argue about what had holed the roofs. Look at what it cost the man in the cupola. He survived, and survivors of these attacks described the same thing to their interrogators later. Not the flame, which was too fast to remember, but the sound. The tank ringing like a struck bell, the concussion in the teeth, the certainty, arriving a half-second before the impact, that the direction they had been taught to ignore had finally come for them. The strongest tank on Earth burned in the open because its designers, in 1941, had answered a question the war stopped asking. They armored the front against the gun they feared. They left the roof to face a threat that did not yet exist, and when the threat arrived, riding a 5-inch tube of steel down the line of an American dive, the men inside had exactly 26 millimeters between their heads and the sky. It was not enough. By that summer, everyone on both sides knew it was not enough. A clipboard survives from an operational research team that walked the Falaise pocket in late August, counting wrecks in the heat. And the tally on it is not the one anyone in a briefing tent wanted to read. The teams were British and Canadian, sent out to prove what the rockets had done, and they went vehicle to vehicle across the roads where the German 7th Army had died, kneeling in the wreck stink of burned rubber and cooked flesh, prying open engine decks and turret roofs to find the hole that killed each machine. They expected to credit the fighter bombers with the slaughter. The slaughter was real. The credit was not. Look at the numbers, because they are cruel in a specific way. Of the German armored vehicles examined in the pocket, the operational research sections could attribute only a small fraction to rocket fire, single digits in some sample areas, out of tanks that ran into dozens. The Typhoon squadrons had claimed hundreds of tanks destroyed in the same days. The teams on the ground found that the great majority of the armor had been abandoned, burned by its own crews, or knocked out by anti-tank guns and artillery, and left where it stopped when the fuel ran dry, or the road ahead filled with wrecks. The rocket, the weapon the Germans feared above all others, was one of the least accurate things in the sky. Here is the arithmetic nobody put in the recruiting film. The rocket had no proximity guidance, no lock, nothing but the pilot's eye down the reticle and the physics of the dive. In gunnery trials against a target the size of a tank, the average pilot in a firing pass put something like 4 in 100 rockets on it. 4. The dispersion pattern from a diving aircraft threw the salvo across an area far wider than any single Tiger, and small errors in the dive angle, the airspeed, the wind, the pull of gravity on a slowing motor, walked the whole ripple off the mark. A salvo of 8 or 10 rockets was not 8 or 10 chances to kill a tank. It was one thin chance, bought with a great deal of steel. So the picture that emerges from the clipboards is not the picture from the cockpit, and both are true. The pilots were not lying. A man in a diving Thunderbolt, pulling 3Gs in the recovery with the whole airframe shuddering and the ground filling his windscreen, saw the flash and the smoke and the burning hull and logged a kill, and could not have known that the hull was already dead, hit by a 17-pounder an hour before, or torched by a crew that had run out of gas and matches both. The fog of that low, fast, violent work made every burning tank look like his burning tank, and the deflating truth does nothing to the fear. Sit with that. Because the German crews did not have the clipboards either. They could not know that the rocket that ringed their hull like a struck bell missed far more often than it hit. They only knew that the sky killed, that it killed from the one angle their armor could not answer, and that it killed without warning at the end of a sound that arrived too late. A weapon does not have to be accurate to empty a road. It only has to be believed. And the men who abandoned their trucks in the ditches, who scattered into the fields at the first engine note, who parked 57 tons of irreplaceable steel under a tree and prayed the branches held. They were reacting to a terror that the mathematics could not touch, because the terror was not built on hit percentages. It was built on the burning tiger they had already seen, and on the certainty that theirs might be next. So the rocket did its work twice. It killed some tanks, fewer than anyone claimed, and it drove an entire army off the roads in daylight, cost it the speed and the fuel and the cohesion it needed to fight, and did that whether or not any given salvo found its mark. The paralysis Rommel described was real. The graveyard of vehicles was real. The German officer taped at Trent Park saying you could not move by day was telling the truth about his war. He was simply wrong about the odds. The Tiger's designers had armored against the gun they could measure. They never found a way to armor against the thing that could not be measured at all. The fear of a weapon that missed 9 times out of 10 and still owned the sky over every road in France. The clipboards proved the rockets rarely killed. The empty roads proved it did not matter. By September of 1944, the change in the German tank crew's world was complete, and it had almost nothing to do with how often the rocket actually killed. The roof hole in Kessler's Tiger back in July had been a mechanical fact. 26 millimeters of plate, 1 5-inch warhead, 1 dead crew. What spread out from that hole across the whole front was something the metallurgists could not weigh. The crews stopped fighting the way they were trained to fight. They stopped moving when they needed to move. A weapon that a British clipboard would prove missed 19 times out of 20 had reached into every hull in Normandy and rewired the men inside it. Watch what that did to an army. A tank that only rolls at night is a tank arriving late. A column that scatters into the ditches at the first engine note is a column that takes 4 hours to cover ground. It should cover in 1. Fuel trucks that burn on the roadside do not reach the front, and armor without fuel is a pillbox that cannot turn. The Tiger had been built to dominate a battlefield it could reach. American airpower, riding a rocket that rarely connected, took away the roads that got it there. The machine was never beaten in the duel its designers imagined. It was beaten before the duel, sitting under a tree with cut branches sliding off its deck, waiting for dark. The interrogators heard it in the prisoners over and over, and the words did not change much from man to man. The feeling of helplessness against enemy aircraft, against which we had no defense, had a paralyzing effect. That is, Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best equipped armored formations Germany fielded in the West, describing what the fighter bombers did to men who had trained their whole careers to attack, not to hide. He does not talk about casualties. He talks about the feeling, the paralysis, the absence of an answer. Panzer Lehr had been assembled to spearhead counterattacks, and by that summer, its commander was reduced to explaining why his tanks could not use a road in daylight. The terror was the real warhead. It did what the steel warhead could not do reliably, because it did not need a hit to work. It only needed the memory of one burning tiger and the sound of an engine coming out of the west. And here, the irony turns back on itself. The Germans understood exactly what had been done to them, and after the war, their officers wrote it down in the Foreign Military Studies for the United States Army, spelling out in careful detail how enemy air had stripped them of movement, how the fighter-bomber over the road had mattered more than the tank on it. The men who read those reports most closely were American. The lesson the Wehrmacht paid for in burned columns became American doctrine. Close air support welded to the ground scheme. The aircraft over the road treated as the thing that decides whether the armor below it lives. The Tiger's designers had armored the front against the gun. Their successors and ours went looking for the roof. Out of that hunt came the top attack weapon built on purpose, the guided missile that climbs and dives onto the deck where the plate is thinnest, the submunition that rains down on the engine grill, the whole family of systems that treat the roof as the door. The Americans who had stumbled into the answer with an unguided rocket in 1944 spent the next 50 years making it deliberate. They built the defense against the thing that had won for them, because the next Kessler might be sitting in an American hull. The reversal did not stop there. The nation that turned the sky over the road into a weapon, that watched a 5-inch rocket rewrite the tank crew's world and then built its army around the idea, found the idea used against its own armor in the decades after, by cheaper missiles in poorer hands, aimed at the same thin plate over the same crews. The top of the tank stayed the door it had always been. Only the men going through it changed. The Falaise clipboards are still in the files. So are the Trent Park transcripts and the Foreign Military Studies and the accounts of the crews who lived through a near miss and could describe the sound but never the flame. Set them beside the hole in Kessler's turret roof, and the whole thing lines up. A weapon that mostly missed, an army that mostly ran, and a machine built to be unkillable that died on open roads in the French summer. A German tank officer put it plainly to his American interrogator after the war. "You did not need to hit us. You only needed to be overhead.